Life in sport is a game of inches. One missed kick, one missed catch, 1/100,000th of a second short, and you may find yourself on the wrong side of history, left with only the thought of what could have been. How victory, glory, and sports immortality was in the palm of your hand, and within the blink of an eye it's gone. And you know what? That sucks. To be so close yet so far away. And what sucks even more is having to chew on the bitterness and enmity of losing while you watch the victorious parade around in front of you, relishing in the spoils that could have so easily been yours. It's heartbreaking, it's cruel, and it isn't always fair, but that's life. Because we know that history will only reward and remember the victor. And with each passage of time, the only one who remembers the runner-up is the runner-up. For today's story, we will talk about how one motorcycle manufacturer was so close to that glory and had built one of the greatest motorcycles of its time, only to watch another manufacturer rob them of that glory in the final minutes, right in front of their face, then revel in the spoils that could have so easily been theirs. It is a story of how history has slowly forgot about the greatest motocross bike that has ever been built. In the world of motocross racing, no other moment has been any more magical than the 1997 Las Vegas Supercross, when Doug Henry piloted the experimental and underdog Yamaha YZ400F 4-stroke motocross bike to victory against the almighty dominant two-strokes that had ruled the class for decades. And by doing so, the Yamaha YZ400F went from laughingstock to legend overnight. And it became the first 4-stroke motocross bike to win a supercross race at the very highest level of racing against the best riders in the world. And from that moment on, history had been etched in stone. Because forevermore, the word Yamaha, the YZ400F, and Doug Henry would be remembered as the parties who were responsible for creating motorcycling's version of the Chicxulub Impactor, setting off a mass extinction event towards two-stroke dirt bikes from motocross competition. They would always be known as the ones that started it all. But the truth is, the YZ400F wasn't the first competitive 4-stroke in motocross or supercross. In fact, it arguably wasn't the best 4-stroke even made at the time. But you see, Yamaha gets the credit because it was the first to win on the main stage under the bright lights against the very best riders in the world, and that is what people remember. But what has been forgotten is just a year earlier, there was this little-known tiny European motorcycle manufacturer that was struggling for its financial life after recently emerging from bankruptcy. And they were desperate to make a name for themselves on the world stage. And they would take one of the biggest financial risks imaginable, and they would mortgage their entire future on just one concept. But the concept itself wouldn't be enough. They would still need a lucky break, a door of opportunity to open, and they would get it when in 1996 Yamaha would lobby the AMA Racing organization to allow 4-stroke motorcycles to race in the Premier Series. That door would open, and they would march boldly through it like an army of Spartans seizing a fortress. And the end result is they would build a 4-stroke motocross bike that was so advanced it would be the first of its kind to ever be seen, and it would be the first 4-stroke race bike to ever qualify for an AMA Supercross event. That little-known European company was KTM, and the bike would be known as the KTM 540 that would later become the KTM 520 when it went into production. Now here's where things get interesting. Back in 1995, the whispers in the industry was that Yamaha was going to lobby the AMA to allow 4-stroke development bikes to race in the Premier Series. So it was no secret to anyone that Yamaha was building a 4-stroke race bike. As to what kind of bike it would be and when and where they would unveil this motorcycle was uncertain, but all of the manufacturers knew well in advance that something from Yamaha was coming. And still today, history remains confused as to why Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki decided to remain idle. But KTM didn't have the luxury to stand by and do nothing at the time. They had no choice but to go all out against Yamaha and take the risk. Otherwise, they might end up bankrupt again. Because KTM back then was a far less established brand than Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki. It was easier to find Bigfoot than a KTM dealership, and if you did, they had less models available on the showroom floors, and their annual sales at the time were about as much as what Honda sold in a single day. They didn't have the resources to drag their feet on this issue, and if all forms of racing were to instantly switch to four-stroke motorcycles, KTM would be toast. And they knew it. And what else KTM knew was something that I guess the other manufacturers didn't know or didn't care to know, is that while four-stroke motocross racing concept in America was new, in Europe it was not. In fact, the European Racing Series had a special 500cc open category support class. It would allow 500cc two-strokes and practically unlimited four-strokes to compete against each other. In the early 1990s, the two-strokes ruled that class, but slowly and surely the four-strokes like the Husqvarna 610TC ridden by Jackie Martins, and the Husaberg that was ridden by Joel Smets, and even the Verna Moody started producing race lap times that were very close to the 250cc two-stroke premier class. Now KTM, being a European company and very active in the European series, could see the future. They knew it was only a matter of time before four-stroke technology would catch up to two-strokes and would become the preferred bike of choice. However, KTM didn't really have a competitive four-stroke in that series. They were constantly getting schooled by Husqvarna and Husaberg. So as the saying goes, if you can't beat them, buy them. KTM and their CEO Stefan Pierre sees that their very best option is to mortgage their future and buy a brand that already has a competitive four-stroke and start from there. They also knew that both Husqvarna and Husaberg, as well as most European manufacturers at the time, were on the brink of financial collapse every week because everybody was buying Japanese motorcycles. So they make a move to acquire Husaberg, and it works. And with that acquisition, they get Husaberg's motorcycles, their bike engine diagrams, parts, and some catchy phrase slogan, ready to race. Now KTM has a bike they know is competitive, and the pressure is on to build a top-flight four-stroke. And this is where two unheralded men would become the unsung heroes of the four-stroke revolution and set the stage for KTM to be the brand that you see today. The first was Rod Bush, who was president of KTM North America. He would ultimately greenlight the development of the KTM 540 without the full consent of KTM, because KTM was a little unsettled about taking such a risk at the time, but Rod Bush would go through this anyway. The second was Tom Moen, who would be in charge of building this motorcycle. At the time, the KTM 540 was supposed to be a Husaberg. KTM's original plan was to use the name KTM for street models, then label all of their off-road bikes as Husabergs. But Rod Bush didn't go along with this either. He felt that KTM should always be the marquee brand, and after several tussles with management, they reluctantly agreed to call it a KTM. In addition to that, they decided to rebrand themselves and create an identity. Because when you see a Honda, you see red. When you see Kawasaki, you see green. And when you see Suzuki's, you see yellow. So they decide to change the color of their bikes to orange. And as stated in many interviews with CEO Stefan Pierre, they chose the orange color because it was loud, obnoxious, and attention-getting. And it seems since that day, that's kind of been KTM's MO. Loud, in your face, and ready to race. So KTM would start building this bike even though it wasn't legal to race yet. Then in 1996, Yamaha would officially lobby the AMA and get the four-stroke exemption rule passed. And that would go into effect for the 1997 season. Now, this allowed every manufacturer the right to race a full works motorcycle with only two stipulations. It had to be a four-stroke and they can only race one bike for one season. As soon as the rule is passed, Yamaha is licking its chops. They're now free to build an unlimited works machine with twice the cc displacement of the two-strokes, and it's free from following any of the production rules of any kind. And Yamaha already knows that Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki have nothing, and this is going to be a cakewalk. So right before the 1997 Supercross opener, Yamaha's only problem is wondering when. When are we going to release this monster upon the public and embarrass our enemies? When will be the right time? But on January 17th of 1997, at the second round of the Supercross series in Los Angeles, California, KTM rolls up to tech inspection with a hand-built titanium 4-stroke masterpiece in burnt orange. It was a 540cc bike that produced over 50 horsepower, weighed an anemic 240 pounds or 109 kilograms, and those were incredible numbers by 1997 standards. Thus, KTM, not Yamaha, becomes the first ever 4-stroke exemption bike to compete in the AMA Supercross series. As you could imagine, Yamaha was not too pleased with this, nor was any of the other manufacturers. They were so surprised or mystified by it that they surrounded the bike like paparazzi and started photographing it. And since the Japanese are also known for making some really great cameras, they got some amazing pictures of this masterpiece. While the bike looks the part, most people thought this has to be a gimmick. There's no way this thing is going to be competitive. But KTM rolls up to the starting gate with a mid-pack rider by the name of Lance Smale and quickly proved that this bike is no joke. Now, even though KTM had failed to qualify for the night program, without question, the shocking performance of this 4-stroke took everyone by surprise. The way the loud thumper engine roared throughout the stadium against the plethora of 2-strokes was wild. And the fact that the bike was not an embarrassment, those in attendance could not believe what they were witnessing, that somebody actually built a 4-stroke competitive race bike. The moment was so iconic that the Los Angeles crowd gave Lance Smale and the KTM a 3-minute standing ovation. Now, on a side note, ironically, Doug Henry won the race that night on a Yamaha 250cc 2-stroke. Nonetheless, Yamaha didn't see this coming. I mean, they expected some retaliation from Honda, Kawasaki, or maybe Suzuki, but not KTM. How were they able to pull this off? And just like that, KTM goes from zero to hero and had exactly what it wanted, a competitive 4-stroke motorcycle and the adulation that goes with it. And 3 months later, Lance Smale and KTM would become the first rider and manufacturer to qualify for a Supercross main event on a 4-stroke when they did so at Daytona, Florida. Lance Smale would ultimately finish the main event in 28th place. Now, while 28th may not sound very good, the point had already been made that 4-stroke motorcycles had arrived. They, in fact, were competitive, and it was only a matter of time before a top-tier rider would get on one and score a victory. KTM showed the world that it was possible. But that's where the underdog story ends. And all this would be overshadowed 2 months later when Yamaha and Doug Henry would win the Las Vegas Supercross. And just like that, the version of the hand-built KTM 540 4-stroke would never race again. And Yamaha and Doug Henry's folklore as 4-stroke pioneers would grow, and the greatness of the 540 and the people around it would slowly fade from memory, because history always rewards the victors. How heartbreaking it must have been for KTM to see Yamaha get all the credit for the 4-stroke revolution they helped create. I'm sure they felt the bitterness and enmity of what could have been. They were so close to reveling in the glory, only to be left empty-handed. And now they would be forced to bow in defeat to the Japanese manufacturer behemoths. They would be cast aside and erased from the annals of history, never to be heard from again. It sucks. It's not fair, but it is life. And unfortunately for KTM and the 540, they would never be heard from again. How sad. Wait a minute, it didn't quite end like that. There's actually a much better story here. While they may have lost to Yamaha on the track, they benefited far more from the four-stroke revolution than anyone. Because back then, Yamaha was already a top manufacturer, but KTM was not. So I think KTM's goal in all of this wasn't necessarily victory, but legitimacy. To prove that they could build a competitive four-stroke bike, then compete head-to-head with the Japanese manufacturers. And sooner rather than later, a top rider would show up. You see, back in those days, it was believed that if you wanted to win a world championship, you had to be on a factory team. So Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki always attracted the very best talent. And that's just the cruel side of racing. I mean, if you are the most talented racer out there, you want to be on the best equipment. You are not going to roll the dice on the unproven KTM back then. There's no such thing as any Ken Roczen experiments going on in the late 1990s. That's just how it was. And with all due respect to Lance Smale, as he was a very good, solid, well-rounded rider, and I only wish I was that fast, but Doug Henry was special. He was a legend and one of the greatest racers of his era, and if he was on a KTM, he would have won on that thing too. And as we look back in history, it's still the YZ400F motorcycle that gets the lion's share of the credit. But in my opinion, Doug Henry had more to do with that than the bike. KTM also won in the sales department. When the bike finally went into production as a 520cc model, it was a true one-of-a-kind motorcycle right off the showroom floor. And it had things that Japanese manufactured bikes didn't have. Shiny pipes, oversized handlebars, hydraulic clutch, a counterbalancer, and even electric start. And because KTM was still small at the time, the bike wasn't even listed in the Department of Motor Vehicles as a competition motorcycle. So if you really wanted to license this thing for the street, you were just a few forms away. And when the motorcycle magazines finally got their hands on the 520, they were shocked with its performance. Practically every magazine shootout had the KTM as a hands-down winner. It was lighter, sleeker, more responsive, and faster than the Yamaha. Now I do understand it should be, it was 120cc more, but still it proved that the bike was formidable. The 520 was also successful in other professional four-stroke classes like the White Brothers Championships. They even made an enduro version of this bike that was very popular as well. And because they jumped on that four-stroke movement early, if you wanted to buy a cutting-edge, race-ready four-stroke motorcycle in the late 1990s, you only had two choices: Yamaha or KTM, because it would be another 5 to 6 years before Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki would even show up. Now, of course, Yamaha sold more 400s overall than KTM did their 520s, because Yamahas were more popular, more readily available, and cheaper. But KTM achieved its goal, and they did sell every one of the 520s that they made. And while KTM didn't win the bragging rights as the first four-stroke to win under the bright lights, their gamble paid off. They proved that European motorcycles are not gimmicks and they should be taken seriously. They saw an opening and took it, and that is the bike that made the company we see today. It laid the foundation for turning KTM into the brand that we see, which is the most savage motorcycle company in existence, a company that is willing to continually take risks, to push boundaries, and to win at all costs. And they've been following that formula ever since. They've continued to build bikes that Japanese manufacturers won't. When four-strokes took over motocross and supercross, Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki all but abandoned two-stroke dirt bikes. But KTM didn't. They kept developing those motorcycles, even adding fuel injection and electric start to them. They bought Husqvarna and Gas, just like they did with Husaberg, and rebranded those. They went on to win the prestigious Dakar Rally 18 years in a row, and this has made them the kings of off-road. More than half of all off-road motorcycles that are sold in North America and the European Union are KTM's or one of their sister brands. And they're just not prevalent in the off-road segment. They compete in more forms of motorcycle racing than any other manufacturer. And they have won on almost every level of motorcycle racing imaginable, even in MotoGP. All this has led them to being one of the largest motorcycle brands in the world. And recently, when they surpassed Yamaha in United States sales, I'm sure they took a little extra satisfaction in that. And all of this success can be traced back to the KTM 520. All of this started by filling a void that other manufacturers won't. Because every KTM motorcycle that's built is meant to serve one purpose, and that's to be pushed to the extreme. KTM is a statement brand that aligns itself with statement companies that do radical things. Because their thinking is, if you want overbuilt, conservative, solid machines, you buy Japanese bikes. If you want radical, hardcore, over-the-top machinery, you buy KTM. Of course, with this rapid growth and hardcore philosophy, there comes some consequences. KTM's rapid bike turnover has led to quality control issues, electronic gremlins, parts malfunctions, and everything in between. And when you mention the word KTM, somehow the word unreliable shortly follows. While in many cases this may be unjustified, in a lot of cases it's not. But that's KTM. They are what they are. There's no in-between with them. You never hear a rider say, it's okay, or it's all right. It's either yes or no. They either swear by them or swear at them. And something tells me that KTM likes to thrive on that outcast, rebellious role. They are going to live and die by the sword. But the moral of this story is that life is a game of inches. One step too early or too late and you don't quite make it. And as Al Pacino said in his speech in the Oliver Stone movie On Any Given Sunday, the inches that we need are all around us. They are in every minute and every second of the game, and we'll tear ourselves to pieces for that inch. We claw with our fingernails for that inch because we know that when we add up those inches, it's going to make the difference between winning and losing, between living and dying. And that's exactly what KTM has done.